Right, continuing the archetypes theme as much requested from the other videos on archetypes. Now this one we're looking at the Hermit archetype, or the Hermit Tarot card, let's be more realistic, which is attributed on the Tree of Life to this path here connecting Tiferet to Hesed. It is also attributed to the Hebrew letter Yod, which is always said in Kabbalah to mean the hand. Now, it's not the Hebrew word for the hand, that's Yad, it's Yod. A lot of these Hebrew letters are said to mean something in Kabbalah. That's not to say that is the Hebrew word for. It's not the same thing. It's a Kabbalistic meaning as opposed to the original Hebrew translation. Just wanted to clarify that one. So the Hermit is one of those things which is essentially the person who's withdrawn from humankind but still offers a guiding light. There's a bit of a paradox. How can you withdraw and still offer a guiding light? It is often thought of as the mysterious cloaked figure who is hidden under the cloak, who hides away in a cave, like in the Hermitage, that kind of thing. It's not quite that. Now, to give it a context, quite a few years ago, I was travelling around India on one of my many trips over there. And I was in a fairly rural area, in a beautiful set of villages. And I came across one particular village, or a small town. And the only restaurant I could find was behind a garden. Lovely set of gardens. And as I walked up, the people beckoned me and said, "Hey, come on in." Now, it turned out it was a restaurant owned by ISKCON, which is one of the religious groups or cults, however you want to interpret it. Now, I don't want to get into any aspect of whether ISKCON is good, bad, or any of the scandals that may have been accused. I simply don't know what that is, what they are. But I do know that my experience there was positive. The food was fantastic, obviously vegan. The people were absolutely lovely, and I pretty much spent the better part of an afternoon talking with them. Now, the reason why I ended up there for quite some time, because as I went in, all these happy smiley faces, people seemed to be very, very friendly and nice. Not in that cult-like way we see in Western cults. These people were genuinely happy. On the back wall of the restaurant was a big, big painting. And in there, in the painting, you saw a elderly, wise person, like in the image of the guru. And on one side, there was children playing. Then there were people hard at labour, you know, that classic pulling rocks, that kind of thing. And then another scene in the same painting, there was a funeral and people being, you know, dead people and people grieving. Now, over the head of the picture of the guru or the wise man in there, it basically said, and I'll never forget the words, "The wise man laments not for the living, nor for the dying." I was appalled. How can this possibly be? How can that be wisdom if you don't care? "Aha," they said, "we will bring you lunch and discuss." I thought, fantastic. Now, essentially what they explained to me was that this is not about being disconnected in terms of emotional disconnection and not caring. Because caring doesn't mean you have to lament. And actually this makes a bit of sense to me because I worked in hospitals, and anyone who's worked in frontline healthcare will be familiar with things like you fairly much disconnect from the suffering of the individual you're working with and get on with the care that needs to be given. Certainly in accident and emergency, where you're brought in some fairly horrific things, can you imagine if when the patient is wheeled into accident and emergency, the staff gather to receive the patient, they take one look and break down crying, start whacking their heads, or go, "That's horrible," freaking out and being sick. You don't really want that. There's no wisdom in that. The ability to give the care and the treatment that's needed is important. So this is not necessarily about disconnecting to the point of indifference and not caring, and not having any aspects of responsibility for your fellow man. Because certainly the conversation I had with those individuals, they didn't seem to be like that. They seemed to be very caring indeed. The difference is this. You know, when you watch the news, or maybe you're a bit like me and my wife here, sometimes we watch the news and we realise we've been watching too much of the news recently because we start getting outraged, morally outraged, start getting indignant, start ranting about the government and the elections and who's the better alternative and that kind of stuff. What are we achieving? What have we achieved by that level of emotional engagement with a broadcast that is designed to inflame the passions? Remember, the news is not about giving information, it's about to inflame, it's about getting an emotional reaction. By giving that emotional reaction, what are we achieving? Nothing. but we have the sense that we're doing something. We have the sense that by our outraged engagement with the information, we are somehow affecting the information. No, it doesn't work that way. That's not very wise, is it? Now, to receive the news and to still act in the world in a wise way, for want of a better term, is very, very different. To act in the world as a beacon of light, to act in the world that actually shows people a better way, is much more productive than being the person who's in their living room reacting to the 6 o'clock news. It's not the same thing. That seemed to be the mindset that was being described to me by the people in the ISKCON restaurant regarding that particular mural on the back wall. This is not about withdrawal from society. Because this is a criticism I've also had a lot with the mystics, the gurus, or the sadhus, the various people who withdraw entirely from worldly affairs and proclaim themselves wisdom, enlightenment. How enlightened would they be if they had to go and live in a tower block somewhere in inner city London, for example? How long would those... We see the same thing with the NLP trainers and the other alphabet therapies, personal development gurus, who have this notion of having a great mindset and you can be anything you want to be. And all they achieved was becoming a person who stands on the stage telling other people how to live their lives. That's all they became. But everyone else can become anything they want to be. And of course, they're making lots of money from doing that. And that affords them a certain lifestyle that alleviates a lot of the suffering. And then they'll often say that money doesn't make you happy, etc. Only the rich people seem to say that. I've noticed that one. Money doesn't buy you happiness, that say the people who need it the least. So we have these kind of weird things. Now, can we act in the world, engage in the world with a sense of wisdom from that position of being the hermit who's holding a guiding light? So that's really the fundamental, really the message, for want of a better term, of this set of symbols. But we have to deconstruct it a little bit further than that. Because in the arcane archetypes within the hermit card, there's embedded a whole load of additional stuff that make it a little bit more complex. And these are the things that are often overlooked when people consider tarot as merely fortune telling. What does that card mean? Oh, that means blah, 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 blah. Yeah, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than just that divination interpretation. So let's just go to some of the key features on this particular card. And of course, I'm sticking with the Crowley Thoth deck. Some people say Tot. I hear all sorts of weird pronunciations. I don't know. We'll stick with this particular version of the card simply because it's the one I'm most familiar with. And in all honesty, I think it is the most superior of the decks, simply because Crowley's... not academic, what's the word? The depth of his writing and investigation into the symbols and their origins is superior to any other thing I've seen. Too many cards focus purely on intuitive interpretation, otherwise just imagination projection, and artistic rendition. Oh, they look lovely. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they don't necessarily convey the origins and the archetypes. So let's pull up the card and see what we got. So what we're seeing here is a figure in profile. They're turned away, and that's a key feature here. You don't actually see the person's face. They are holding a lantern. In the lantern there, it is actually the sun. That's a key feature. You'll see in that parting of the green stuff, we'll get to that in a sec, there's like an egg with a snake wrapped around it. That's the Orphic egg. It's from Greek mythology. We also have a thing that looks like a weird wand in the sort of the Golden Dawn tradition. That's actually a spermatozoa. I'll get to the symbolism of that in a second. All the green stuff around is actually wheat. And we have the three-headed hound of hell, Cerberus, the hound of Hades, again from Greek mythology. Cerberus is the three-headed god that basically guards the underworld. It keeps the dead dead, and it stops the living dropping down under there. So basically, you don't want that scenario of all the dead coming back. It can be really inconvenient at Christmas and birthdays and stuff like that, when you've got great Uncle George who you buried 25 years ago. Next thing you know, he's sitting at your dinner table. It would just be a bit weird. There's been a fantastic series, actually. The French original is the best, called The Returned. The Americans made a series too. Very good. Not as atmospheric as the French. So highly recommend The Returned. It kind of features what life is like when they all start coming back, where Cerberus doesn't do his job properly. So it separates the underworld from the upper world, or from the living from the dead. Now that's a key feature, because a lot of the gods, a lot of the mythologies, you have what they call psychopomps. Now the psychopomps are the guides to the dead. They basically take the dead into the underworld to show them their place. They're the guides. And essentially these are the gods that descend into the underworld. In modern day religions, the Abrahamic religions, we don't have psychopomps. They've not been included. Essentially, the only things in the underworld, in hell, are the demons. Hell, or Hades as it was before, or the underworld, is not visited by gods. It's only the demons that are down there. So we've got a slight corruption in how the ancients, pretty much globally, envisaged the underworld versus the above world, whatever we want to call it. However, in Christianity, if you actually read the book as opposed to just listen to the Christians, the dead don't go to heaven. That's not how it works. The dead go into the underworld, awaiting their time of resurrection in Judgment Day, basically, when the dead come out of the chosen ones, the faithful, the believers, come out of their graves and ascend to heaven. So the dead don't go straight to heaven, unless you're one of the thieves next to Christ up on the cross, where tonight you'll join me, blah, 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 blah. That thief bypassed the underworld, went straight to heaven. And so did Enoch, when God takes him and turns him into Metatron, the angel, depending on which texts you read. So we've got this underworld with this above world, and the Cerberus divides the two, or keeps the gate closed. However, the psychopomps can guide. The hermit's not a psychopomp. The hermit is very much in the world of the living, hence why we have Cerberus there. Now, what we also have here, if we just go to the Greek Orphic egg. The Orphic egg it comes from I think it's pronounced Phanes or Phanes, I don't know, Phaens. Phanes is the golden-winged primordial being that hatches, or hatched from the shining cosmic egg, you can tell I'm reading this, that was the source of the universe. This is parthenogenesis. This is essentially the universe coming into being without having to have male, female, positive, negative, whatever the polar opposite things are coming together. In parthenogenesis, this is small little creatures, Daphnia pulex. Great name, Daphnia pulex. Water fleas to you and me. They're capable of it too, so they can reproduce. Lots of little creatures can. They're usually sort of, obviously, cold-blooded little things. Can reproduce asexually, so they don't need to be fertilized. And essentially, they always give rise to a female who then can continue parthenogenesis. Now, of course, from a genetic lineage, that's not necessarily the most effective. So they need sexual reproduction as well as asexual reproduction, parthenogenesis. Now, that term, parthenogenesis, in turn, comes from, let me just quickly look this up so I've got it for you, the constellation of Virgo. I know, weird associate. Now, Virgo is the Virgin. Now, in one of the Greek myths, this is Parthenos, as in where parthenogenesis comes from, Parthenos, which actually means virgin in Greek. And obviously, the astrological sign of Virgo is the Virgin. And it actually explains how the mythology explains how the actual constellation of Virgo came into being. And essentially, wheat is the recurring association with Virgo, hence why wheat is appearing in this card. So essentially, with Parthenos, the Virgin who reproduces, we have parthenogenesis. So now, have a think about this particular aspect alone. So we've got the Orphic egg, which again is parthenogenesis in its modern term. We've got the wheat, which is symbolizing Virgo. We've also got the Demeter and Persephone mythology in there as well, which also invokes Hades, the underworld. I'm not going to go into the Demeter and Persephone mythologies. There's quite a lot there. It's quite a complex thing. It's about the seasons and variations. Do look that up if you want to know more about that. I'm not particularly big on Greek mythology. It's not my knowledge area at all. But now we have essentially things coming into being from something else. but without sexual reproduction. So one of the key things of this card, it's about fertility. It's about production, but not necessarily reproduction. And if we just come to the spermatozoa that's there on the lower left of the card, it's really hard to see it actually on the card. But if you look up how the ancients drew what a sperm looked like, this was the notion that they had. In some of the sperm, depending on which testy it came from, basically you had one testicle that produced the males and one that produced the females. That's why there's two testicles, both seem to produce sperm. Well, one must be masculine, one must be feminine. That's how they envisaged it. And inside the head of the sperm itself was a tiny, tiny little person. They didn't have this idea that you started off as a little random-looking bunch of globular cells that then started to form into something. They had this idea that you inside the head of the sperm was the tiniest little man or woman, who would then be inserted into the egg. And by getting into the egg, that's now the menstruum, that's the thing, the nutrient, whatever, in which that thing then grows. And that little tiny person then starts growing from a little person into the baby, and then obviously gets born. Now, it kind of interests me a little bit in the days before microscopes. I don't know if you ever look at sperm, but it doesn't really look like lots of little tiny things wriggling around because you can't see, it's too small. So how they had this notion, how these ideas were found and developed, still astonish me. That people worked stuff out, usually just through observation, and people putting things together. They started to work stuff out. Now, obviously, the conclusions they came to are biologically and factually incorrect, but it doesn't matter. This is the archetype that we have. So there's the little sperm in there as well. So again, even though the sperm denotes sexual reproduction, in its original form here, it doesn't. Because even though it grows in the egg, the sperm itself was seen to have the complete human inside it. It wasn't like half a human and the egg is the other half, like as we understand it to be. It didn't work that way in the ancient form. Hence why the sperm can go in there and it fits within this parthenogenesis type idea of fertility. Now, we have to now look at what is fertility. What is it? It is the production or the creation of life. And in this form, this is the production of something. It is the creative form of life. It's the creative form of something from what is already there. Now, this is something now to start thinking about. If you are the hermit, what ideas can you generate that are coming from you, from your collective wisdom, your collective knowledge of the world, to the point now you can bring forth your ideas? The majority of people have greatness in them. I don't doubt it. They always say there's a book in everybody, but they'll never get to write it. And I think that's a pity. And I think a lot of people don't have the confidence. They don't have the wherewithal in their personality. They haven't had the confidence given to them in life to be able to actually set forth ideas. They've never risked painting, sculpting, creating. They've never risked writing, creating poetry, writing a screenplay. Because for them, there is a risk, there is a fear of criticism and very mortal stuff. The wise man laments not for the living or the dying, i.e. does not engage with that level of humanity. They just bring forth their wisdom to serve as a guiding light. And in this case, it's the sun. Now, we can lead the horse to water, but we can't make it drink, and that is exactly true for people too. We can show them a way, we can present to them the wiser way, the better way, we can present to them the opportunities. We can't make them do it, we can't make them carry it through, we can't force people to wake the hell up. Because so many people are anaesthetized by their social media, they're anaesthetized by their intoxicants, whether it's coffee, whether it's their alcohol or whatever other drugs they're doing. People are intoxicated by their screen time and their social media use and so forth, and we can't snap them out of it. To force people to wake up, to force people to be educated, to force people to accept our wisdom, actually is just to impose tyranny. And so many tyrannical societies, tyrannical organizations begin with an attempt to create something better, but all they end up is oppressing. And this is, again, part of the wisdom of the hermit. We're not engaging with the worldly affairs, but we are showing much better ways of being. We're presenting better examples. We're giving better information, creating opportunities, and so forth. But the majority of people aren't. They're too busy followers. They're too busy, intoxicated, asleep inside their what I think of as their comas. The coma of how it's safe. They're in the coma of security of a way of being. And they're never actually developing themselves. And this is one of the areas of where we now think about self-development. An awful lot of self-development, especially if you listen to the psychology, personal development coaches, life improvement, the life hack gurus, all that kind of stuff. It's all about getting out of your comfort zone. They seem to love that one. But to what end? Because most of the time, people aren't developing something inside themselves. They're acquiring memes, they're acquiring headline pieces of data from this source, that source, and that source, and trying to apply that to their lives. So it's basically applying stuff from the outside to try and change what's within, rather than examining what is within and developing that and bringing it out. Very different process. Certainly there are some processes. I saw this done in the military. I was never in the military, but I worked for the military for a while. And I was very impressed what I saw. This was with the British Army. Very impressed what I saw with some of the senior trainers, particularly the regimental sergeant major that was on the base that I was at, who had a very nice way, very skillful way, that would essentially bring out the best in people, as opposed to put constraints on their negative behaviors, to try and shape the person, put them into a corner and make them do what you want them to do. He had a brilliant manner about him to actually bring out things in people. And he was basically pretty much respected by everyone. He was terrifying, but a really nice guy. And I would say I was full of admiration for him as well. There's a big, big difference in bringing something out from yourself and developing it, as opposed to attending endless courses, reading endless books to try and reshape yourself from the outside. The hermit is that thing I'm talking about, bringing something out from within yourself. It's almost like parthenogenesis. You are what you are. Now generate stuff from that rather than try and sort of constrain it, fit in even more, fit in even better, and so forth. So now let's just look at a couple of other little details that are very commonly overlooked with this card, especially when it's in the tarot of Aleister Crowley and the Thoth tradition. And that is the hermit's face is in profile. Now this denotes or alludes to the myth of Osiris. And actually in this particular card, this is one of those hidden things. This is Osiris on his way to the east, seeking wisdom. So the journey to the sun. Now that's the key bit. To the east, if you look at Masonic temples, Masonic lodges, magic temples, whatever, is always orientated to the east. Except in some of the Thelemic rituals, of course, Crowley reorientated that to north, but that's a video for an entirely different day. East is essentially where the sun rises. And the hermit is carrying at his waist. Notice the where the lantern is, which has the sun inside, is actually at the waist height, denoting basically that is the source of life. So basically at the nads, at the gonads. So now we have the sun, of which Osiris being a solar tradition and so forth, raised, resurrected, dead and resurrected, that kind of shit. What we have now is the cyclical nature of life itself, but also the source of life, the sun being the source of life. One of the common things that we see, especially in the modern religions, the source of life is outsourced elsewhere into a spiritual form denoted as God or whatever the spiritual form is. Technically, the source of life that we have, particularly within our solar system, but not necessarily in the universe. You have to bear in mind the ancients weren't necessarily aware of the greater universe, but they were certainly aware of the solar system. The source of life within our solar system on this planet is the sun. Now, whether there's the starseed element, which is DNA arrived here, traveling around on a meteorite or whatever on the planet, the actual source of life itself is still the sun. That's where the energy comes from. And so there is the generative force. And the force that is generative doesn't require the polar opposites, the dualities, the male, female, positive, negative, basically sexual reproduction to do so. So it's just another nod to this pathogenic production of wisdom, of knowledge, of knowing, of essentially offering a guiding light to the world, offering a guiding light to humanity. So now we have to look at a slight problem here. And I can see a trap for the novice, a trap for the person who is not really doing the work elsewhere. In considering the tree of life, looking at the different Sephiroth, looking at the different aspects, we are trying to develop all things in balance. And often that requires us to balance up, to develop those things within ourselves that we don't necessarily favor. The person who is much more aggressive, alpha, dominant individual will seek to have more of that. The person who is much more nurturing and controlling at the same time will seek to have more of that. Essentially, a lot of people end up completely tilting in terms of where they're developing on the tree, and they're not doing the other stuff. The intellectual person will develop more of the intellect, less of the creative. The creative person will have more of the creative output, but not necessarily the intellect, and so on. Now, if we're just purely focusing on this particular path, this is the bit of bringing out the truth from within. Now we have the post-truth era where everyone has to speak their truth. Everyone has to be the one who says, well, my truth is. And then we end up with the Oprah Winfrey mindset of everyone speaking their truth. And now objective truth, objective reality is lost. That is not what this is. That is what happens when a person brings out their own inner wisdom in absence of any of the other factors distributed around the tree of life. What they're doing is they're focusing on one particular thing, and they're not doing it in balance and in conjunction with all the other work. The work of the initiate in this way is immense. There's lots of stuff to be introspective about, lots of personal development to be doing, lots of work to be done. And unfortunately, the human failing is people are lazy and they indulge their ego. They indulge their emotional need in the material world. Essentially, they seek to be a god in the domain of Asaya in Malkuth, Malkuth in Asaya. They're not working their way up the tree. They're not developing stuff. They're very much right down the bottom in the delusional belief that they're becoming gods. Most of them are just narcissists. And unfortunately, that is a side effect of this kind of spiritual development work. So don't fall for the trap of developing the truth within to bring it out, to bring it into the world, to espouse your wisdom for mankind. Well, that's basically based on stupidity. We would hope the hermit, prior to that aspect, has done a lot of development, a lot of education, a lot of knowledge, has a lot of life experience. They're not a 21-year-old life coach. There was an era a number of years ago, we had loads of those. 20-something life coaches absolutely everywhere, telling everyone else how to live. They're now professional development, personal development coaches on the stage telling everyone else how to live, just in a different way. Mostly telling them that money's not important, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's all I have for this particular video. There's probably more I haven't covered. Obviously, there's the comment section below, those who've made it this far. Comment section below, anything I've missed, do stick it in there. Any questions, any criticisms, any counter-examples, stick it in there. Always interested to see those as well. Thank you for watching this far. Click the like button, do subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.